Dear Professor Jørgensen, dear Professor Sardanidis, dear colleagues, dear students, dear attendees, dear friends, thank you for attending this virtual gathering today. Thank you for your participation and support of this initiative. I need to extend a heartfelt thank you to the director of the Institute, Dr. Haralambous Sardanidis, and the researchers of the research program for embracing and facilitating this idea, and of course my colleagues for their constant help and support, Ms. Stella Miliotti and Mr. Dimitris Polalis. Most importantly, I thank our first distinguished speaker, Dr. Knud Erik Jørgensen. Professor Jørgensen, as the head of the research program, I express my sincere gratitude to you for supporting this initiative and for your collaboration. Thank you so much. We have gathered in this virtual event to inaugurate the Institute of International Economic Relations Distinguished Virtual Lecture Series that is organized by the Research Program on the Theory and Practice of International Relations of the Institute. The Distinguished Virtual Lecture Series aims to delve into the rich and diverse world of international relations by featuring prominent theorists and brilliant speakers from around the world who have made important contributions to the field. The goal of the lectures is to reinforce old roots of research and reinstate new approaches that could inform IR theory in an inter- and transdisciplinary manner to inspire new research ideas to young scholars and practitioners. Exposure to different theoretical perspectives challenges preconceived notions, encourages open-mindedness, and broadens attendees' intellectual horizon. Attendees of these web events can gain access to the expertise of renowned scholars who are not always available for one-on-one interactions in person. It is especially an effort to acquaint the Greek audience with diverse scholarships in the field of international relations, since the Greek curriculum does not always focus on IR theory in a pluralist and critical manner, leaving interested graduate students, PhD candidates, and the Greek scholarly community with a constant thirst for more information, debates, and knowledge. We aspire that these virtual lectures will foster a comprehensive view of the field and encourage critical thinking beyond popular intellectual avenues. We hope that these lectures will stimulate intellectual engagement and discussion, promoting a deeper appreciation of the nuances of international relations. Theorists have also the opportunity to discuss the real-world applications of their frameworks and theoretical propositions, and elaborate on how they relate to current global phenomena and relevant policy challenges, such as the war in Ukraine, grand power competition and the rise of China, Europe's new security challenges, protracted conflicts, world order transition, the future of the liberal international order, and so forth. Hence, the most important reasons for encouraging the organization of these virtual lectures are the encouragement and promotion of critical thinking, and the ability to evaluate different conceptual frameworks and their implications for global politics, without obsessing with or focusing unilaterally on either one of the IR theory research programs, as, for example, it often happens with realism and its streams in Greece. This is what we are gathered to engage in here today and in all forthcoming virtual lectures. In addition, the research program on the theory and practice of international relations wishes to build a community of individuals from around the world, a network of scholars, intellectuals, practitioners, and students who are interested in international relations, and especially in theory, fostering ongoing discussions, critical epistemological examinations of the field, and debates in our effort to interpret and manage the world in times of complexity and polycrisis. So we are very honored to open this cycle of virtual lectures with a timely lecture, Liberal International Relations Theory in Europe, the End of the Beginning, by our first distinguished speaker, Professor Knud Erik Jørgensen. Professor Jørgensen is Professor Emeritus at Aarhus University. He's a co-editor of the book series Palgrave Studies in International Relations and the European Union in International Affairs. Publications include the Sage Handbook of European Foreign Policy, International Relations Theory, A New Introduction, co-edited with Oriol Costa, The Influence of International Institutions on the European Union When Multilateralism Hits Brussels, co-edited with Katie Latikainen, a handbook on the European Union and international institutions, performance, policy, power. Articles of his have appeared in European Journal of International Relations, Journal of European Integration, Journal of European Public Policy, Cooperation and Conflict. And he was a part of the Coast Action Center Network, the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Network, and a research project of the European External Action Service. His most recent books are What is International Relations and the Liberal International Theory Tradition in Europe. He is also the co-founder and past president of the European International Studies Association. So before I give the floor to Professor Jørgensen, I would like to inform you that after the conclusion of his lecture, there will be a Q&A session during which you can turn your camera and your microphone on and pose your question or engage in the discussion. But please raise your hand first and I will call you to speak. Or you can write your question or comment in the chat and I will read it, but please note in a personal message to me. In the meantime, please turn off your microphones. So Professor Jørgensen, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by actually sharing my screen. So thank you very much for inviting me to give this guest lecture. Thank you for organizing it. I'd like to thank the Institute of International Economic Relations, its director, Karalampos Chateridis, and Effie Karalampaki. The title of the talk is Liberal International Relations Theory in Europe, the End of the Beginning. And I will show you my first slide in case that you are not totally aware of what is in the focus, namely Europe. What the title refers to, the part about the end of the beginning, I'll get to later, because I have divided the talk into 5 different parts. I'll first explain why I believe this topic is important, and I have a couple of reasons, as you can see. I also have some delimitations. There's something that I will not talk about. So what will I be talking about and what's not? In other words, what's the scope of what I'll be talking? Then I'll talk about various varieties of liberal international relations theory in Europe. And as you can see, I hint that there are many varieties. Then I'll try to explain to you what I mean by the end of the beginning, and finally, why that leads to a challenge. So, why is it that I believe that this is an important topic? In order to explain this, I have found an old citation by Macpherson. As you can see, he wrote this text in 1941. That is a time that was exceptionally difficult for Europe. It was at the beginning of the Second World War. And what he is observing in this citation is that the liberal democratic tide has sort of receded. It has been on a downward slope for a decade. And for that reason, he believed that it is very important to pay some attention, actually, to be very focused on the basic elements of liberal and democratic philosophies. I believe, or it seems to me, that we are in a not exactly the same situation, but in a situation that is similar to this one. So for that reason, those who care about the basic elements of the liberal and democratic philosophies, I think it's time to really do some serious thinking in order to investigate the conditions for the effective maintenance of liberal and democratic philosophies. We have seen all sorts of challenges to these philosophies from the far right and from the far left. And this is the first reason. So I think it's a very it's a very topical topic that I've chosen, and there's a reason for it. And this is the first one. The second reason is very different. Here I have a citation of Saka and Matthew, some 30 years ago almost, where they observe what I think is a surprising fact, namely a systematic presentation of liberal international theory is not offered in any well-known text. There might be a little bit of a change to that situation in the meantime, but not too much. Actually, I take this to suggest that the tradition is not widely recognized as a tradition, and that includes the self-images among those who otherwise consider themselves as liberal-oriented scholars. So the self-images are more dispersed than concerted, and that is a good reason to pay some attention to the topic. The third reason, here I rely on an American, Dr. Puchala.
I told you,
Who is
beginning. Okay.
Sorry?
What?
Oh, I apologize. Please turn off your microphones, everybody. I apologize, Dr. Jørgensen. Thank you.
So third reason, and that is sort of a positive one, in many views or perspectives, also a very controversial one, because Puchala stated about 20 years ago that liberal international theory contains a highly sophisticated and by and large accurate description of the state of contemporary international relations. That's quite something. According to Puchala, this is the one to choose if you want something that is accurate and is also sophisticated. So that's three good reasons why the topic is worthwhile talking about, and this is what I will do. But I will not talk about everything. First of all, there is a very important scope condition for what I'm talking. I'm only talking about international relations liberal theory in Europe. And this is, in many minds, really a big challenge. It's controversial, it's problematic, because how can I sort of slice the world into continents, into different geographies? And this is something that I experienced when being involved in editing a Paul Grave book series, Trends in International Relations Theory in Europe. Many of our contributors had really serious problems in understanding that it's possible to assess, evaluate what comes out of a distinct geographical area. To me, that is difficult to understand, but it was a widespread tendency. Also, when we sometimes got the first drafts in and we saw, okay, what was delivered, it was sometimes an accurate account, but it was almost 100% American scholars who were cited. So that doesn't say very much. It doesn't tell very much about the state of affairs of this particular tradition in a different part of the world. And the surprise or the sort of intriguing feature of this is even more because it is perfectly possible to write an entire book about international relations at the London School of Economics. Of course, there is a 100-year-long tradition, even more than 100 years, of cultivating international relations as a discipline at that school in London. So why is it possible to do it for a department? Maybe sometimes for a country, but not for Europe. Again, I will only talk about Europe, including the countries and the departments that you find in this part of the world. So I will not talk about the rest. And I think that has some advantages. Of course, it only gives sort of a partial view of how liberal international theory of a liberal orientation exists, how it's thriving or not worldwide. But that's a different topic. That's a wider topic. It's a different scope. Delimitation number 2. My focus is on international relations liberal theory, not all sort of liberalism or liberal X, Y, or Z. So I'll not talk about liberal ideology. I will not talk about a liberal lifestyle or ways of life. I will not talk about liberal political philosophy. I'll not talk about liberal economics, whether neoliberal or laissez-faire, the old version. And liberal politics is not part of this talk. I will also not talk about the liberal international order, even if there is some in the context of my talk that makes it relevant to talk about the liberal international order. but it is the northwestern corner of this figure, international theory, that I'll talk about. So just for you to know what you can expect and what you cannot expect. Then the third delimitation is the time frame. I will not talk about liberal international theory at all times, because even if the trajectory of liberal international theory is long and winding, also in Europe, I have sort of sliced the time frame into just 100 years. There's a beginning, there's a middle phase, and there's a contemporary phase. The first one starts off 1919. If you want me to be provocative, I can say that it started in some May evening, 1919, in a certain Hotel Majestic in Paris, where a bunch of advisors to the Versailles peace negotiations were getting bored, and they were thinking about what they could do. But of course, a discipline doesn't arrive just by in one night at a certain meeting. It develops organically over time. But there is a certain rationale for talking about the first 30 years. There's also a rationale of talking about the conditions during the Cold War. So that's the second phase. And there is a rationale of the third phase as well. What happens after the end of the Cold War? What changed? And did we actually use that opportunity? So why is it that I don't go further back before 1919? Simply because I talk about liberal international relations theory in the context of the scientific discipline of international relations. And that has its symbolic beginning at that year, 1919. Then if we look at the second phase, and we look at Europe, how fertile is the European soil for liberal ideas of any sort? Not very fertile, not at all, because authoritarian and totalitarian governance in most of Europe did not really, or did not exactly promote liberalism of any sort. During the Cold War, it was not much better, slightly better, but not in parts of Europe, not at all. East of the Iron Curtain, authoritarian or totalitarian rule, in major parts, as I say, continued to discourage liberal undertaking, including academic undertakings. So it was extremely difficult for scholars of a liberal orientation to theorize in a setting of universities. That is where the discipline is being cultivated. Of course, then from 1989 onwards, there was, it seems to me, a fantastic window of opportunity to do it better, to start up something, to initiate, to be entrepreneurial. And we can discuss to which degree scholars in Europe have taken on that window opportunity and actually produced something that would make a difference if you contrast it or compare it to the previous decades of the 100-year period. So this is the third delimitation. Then the varieties. And I found, I hope that you can find this image of a tree helpful to understand what I'm talking about or how I look at things. Because it seems to me that the liberal IIER theory tradition is similar to the trunk of the tree. That trunk, or the tradition, of course, is nurtured by all sorts of things that in the wood or in the tree you find underneath the surface. In the context of social science or humanities, you find all sorts of movements, social movements and their political thinking. You find political philosophies, and you find all sorts of things that the discipline can thrive on, that the discipline can take on and twist and turn as the discipline and its cultivators seem to find fit for the purpose. So there's a lot of taking on ideas and use them for the purpose of understanding international relations much better than without the sources that you find at the roots. Then you have the branches and the leaves, and that is where I see sort of the distinct theories in the whole picture. They come out of the trunk for sure, and some are thriving, some are bigger than others. It's an uneven growth. And this is where sort of the entire tree is alive, but this is where you really sort of see the tree alive and kicking. The trunk is alive too, but it's not alive and kicking to the same degree as the branches and the leaves. The branches and the leaves, or the distinct theories, are also the more dynamic parts of the whole enterprise. Then, of course, when we look at a theoretical tradition, then it's a fact that it's never coherent. It's usually characterized by all sorts of currents of thinking or branches, and each of the branches embody multiple distinct theories. Sometimes you come across articles in journals where an author finds that a given tradition is not very coherent. It seems to me that such critique is unfair, if not irrelevant, because traditions is never coherent. They are always full of different growths, and what should be coherent is a given distinct theory, not the tradition as such. And actually, I think I can generalize this observation and say, you don't have any theoretical traditions that are coherent. They always have internal disturbances, internal tensions, and sometimes a given orientation is stronger and another one is sort of on a downturn slide. So that's the dynamic nature of traditions. That's also why traditions, in my perception, is never sort of static. They're always developing, and if they're not dynamic, then they are about to, in the worst case, actually die, because then they are not relevant for us scholars to understand or to use in our attempt to understand the development of international relations. When it comes to varieties, you can also pay attention to all sorts of differences, for example, between liberal theory in the 1920s, United Kingdom and Germany. The liberal scholars in those two countries were of a very, very different nature. They considered many, many different things in very different ways. The German scholars, liberal scholars, were not very impressed by international law, because they found that international law was fundamentally unfair to Germany. The peace settlement after the First World War, of course, is what they refer to. Whereas in Britain, the main tendency was that international law is, as such, or in principle, very good, and of course should be adhered to. I guess it's only E.H. Carr who had an interpretation that is quite similar to the German, or to the understanding of the interpretation in Germany among liberal scholars. And then E.H. Carr was not particularly liberal, of course. Well, he once was, but then he changed his mind. Also, you can say that Keynes, in his assessment of the peace settlement, were on a similar line compared to the German interpretations of the time. This is a long discussion, of course, and this is not what I think we should get into. I just want to point out that liberal scholars in different settings might assess the very same phenomenon in fundamentally different ways. They also, and this is a different dimension, they also find different features valuable or not. For example, compare how liberal international political theorists are compared to those liberal scholars who mainly do quantitative-oriented democratic peace theory. It is almost as they are living in worlds apart, or in different worlds. They use different languages, and their concerns are very, very different. Finally, just to give a third difference that produces variety, is between those scholars who mainly have an interest in regional integration theory and those who have a global outlook. Of course, there will be differences as well, and the dynamics of how theory in those two different levels have developed fundamentally differently, even if they belong to the very same theoretical tradition. Then one observation is that if you look at liberal scholars or liberal theorists in Europe, typically they don't recognize each other. They don't see the similarities, and for that reason, as a tradition, they are largely unrecognized. They don't see a forest full of trees as the driver in the car. And I think that's, of course, a pity. Sometimes they begin to see the forest, but then that is because they begin to compare their forest to other forests. For example, realism or international political economy or the English school or what the name of the forest are in our discipline. Then when we consider liberal international relations theory in Europe, we should take into account that the conception or the conception of theory changes fundamentally during the 100 years that I cover in this very sort of glimpse-like evaluation of the situation in Europe. What you see on the book on the left is a book published in 1936 by Frank Russell, an American, more than 600 pages. And the reason I came across this book is that, to the best of my knowledge, it's the very first book published that is entitled Theories of International Relations. Now, that's 1936. That's early, you believe, right? But if you look into it, what you find is not what we consider as theory today, 2024, or what was considered theory in the 1950s or the 1980s, and so on. It's basically 600 pages about various reflections, ideas about international affairs. And there are both national and international viewpoints, as you can see in the title. Then something very important happened, not in Europe, but in the United States. And the outcome, or the book you have on the right, is about that moment, when there was a conscious attempt to define what theory should be considered as. It was a conference convened in 1954, paid by the Rockefeller Foundation, and some of the very most prominent scholars at the time were convened, probably a nice place, to discuss how they could introduce or how they could upgrade the sophisticatedness of international relations theory. It should, in their view, be international relations theory of a different orientation, of a distinct orientation, and they tried to elevate realism into this paradigmatic position or dominant position. Of course, that attempt failed, because what was really turning into the dominant paradigm at the time was what you find under the label of behavioral revolution, not so much classical realism. But what I want to emphasize in this context is not sort of the substance of the attempt. It is that the two books reflect on theory in completely different ways. And that development only took, sort of accelerated if you go up through the decades in the 19th century. The theoretical aspects of international relations, edited by William Fox, is the outcome of the first sustained attempt to theorize international relations in a new key, 1959. And on the European side, you have Raymond Aron and his Peace and War from 1962. You would probably, with today's perspective, find that both books were not particularly theoretical. But at the time, they were considered to be sort of avant-garde. And I think this is very telling for how the conception of theory develops over time. So again, if we want to evaluate liberal international theory in Europe, we have to take these changes into consideration. Then the mysterious part of the title, The End of the Beginning. Well, a couple of years ago, I was editing a book with a dozen different chapters in which we tried to take stock of the liberal international theory tradition in Europe. And surprise, surprise, it was among the very first to offer a transnational portrait of that tradition in Europe. I mean, it took almost 100 years before such an attempt were taken. And for that reason, well, it was the first attempt. So yes, we can discuss how deep we managed to dig in that book, but at least we got something sort of highlighted. And I think the main conclusion is that, to the surprise of many, the liberal international theory tradition in Europe is actually more developed than many assume. But on the other hand, it is hardly a thriving tradition because partly, as I mentioned before, it is not a tradition that is recognized as a tradition. Instead, we have maybe a dozen different varieties that each sort of cultivate their corner of the liberal wood or forest. The challenge there, if the beginning has come to an end, then of course there is a need to define the way forward. Again, not for everybody. There is not a need for everybody, to be sure, but at least there is a need, it seems to me, for those who care. For that reason, I repeat the Macpherson citation and say, for those at least who value the basic elements of the liberal and democratic philosophies, it is more important now than at any time during the last 100 years to investigate the conditions for their effective maintenance. So the challenge is to engage in theorizing. And theorizing has many different keys. You can reactivate a certain theory, you can reconstruct one, you can synthesize, you can reappraise. Theorizing is a multiple undertaking. Then, of course, the challenge is not just to theorize because one finds it's funny to do so or challenging intellectually. The challenge is to make liberal theory relevant as an analytical tool and to take on the contemporary and future predicaments in which we are situated. So if we are engaging in theorizing, let's look a little bit about the predicaments. What are the problems, the issue, the processes, and the structures we want to understand, and for which reason we need theories and maybe new theories. The world is big and full of issues. I don't need to get into them all. This could be an image that suggests to some people that there is such a thing as climate change. Of course, the blue planet looks very nice from some distance, but we know that there are a serious problem. In some interpretations, it's one of the worst existential problems that we are facing. It's also a global planet. So yes, we can slice the planet up and we can focus on different areas, regions, but we should not forget that actually it is a full planet. And that is one of the predicaments that we share and to which purpose I think it's worthwhile and maybe even necessary to engage in theorizing what it is that we are facing and maybe thereby enhancing the analytical tools that are at our disposal. Then, of course, we can enter all sorts of disagreements about what we see out there in the world. Is this a multipolar world? Well, in many interpretations it is, but to others it's not, while the world is not becoming multipolar. And of course, we can continue the discussion whether polarity at all is sort of a worthwhile focal point of what we theorize. It's an ongoing discussion, and it should be. This confusing image is one that I created in order to illustrate what John Ruggie means by the global public domain, which I think is as avant-garde liberal thinking as it gets, because it is very complex. It includes much more than the traditional interstate system, because it includes also international organizations. It includes civil society organizations, and it includes transnational corporations. Combined, he conceptualized this as the global public domain. And before he passed away, he managed to publish quite a few articles about this public domain. And the interesting thing about this is that this is a concept that he developed. Of course, that is sort of a contribution to the theoretical reflection about the world in which we're living. But at the same time, it summarizes his experience as Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General of NATO, where he worked on developing what is known as the Global Compact and similar related issues. So it is as the center that FE is conducting. It is about both theory and practice at the same time and how they interrelate. Then an image that suggests maybe that perceptions matter, not only perceptions, but also misperceptions. What matters also is paranoia, one could say, because this is very much sort of a self-image of the situation which Russia finds itself, and increasingly so. And yes, perceptions are perceptions, and therefore they are not the real world, but they have real effects in the real world, as we can see at different front lines around the world right now. So this is also one of the predicaments that we have to sort of take into consideration when we try to upgrade or change or redevelop, reconstruct liberal theory, if that is the theoretical tradition we want to work inside. What about China? There is lots to be said about the rise of China and where China is heading and how China fits into the next 5, 10, 15 years of world affairs. Of course, this is not the time to go into that direction. I just want it as one of the features that we probably also should take into consideration. Here, the European Union is meeting with a new partner, the League of Arab States. It was the first meeting. It's back in 2015, around the time when Federica Mogherini was the High Representative of the European Union in charge of international affairs. And it shows a reality that if someone is sticking too much to sort of ideational norms, then one risks to become less relevant for other actors. For that reason, I guess Mogherini was responsible for developing the concept of pragmatic idealism, or pragmatic, something of that sort, pragmatic for sure. Global trade patterns, if we are doing international political economy, and we can do that with a liberal twist, of course, then there are some really profound changes that are occurring in these years. Yes, we have had globalization for 30 years. Now people are saying that globalization is not what it used to be. Some people talk about deglobalization. Other people say that the configuration of globalization is these years different. But it doesn't mean that the volume of trade, for example, being globalized is sort of on a downward slope. Not at all. It's just differently in its configuration. So if we need to theorize, and that is my suggestion that we do, then do we do, what do we do when we theorize? Again, I lean on Pucciala because I think he has delivered the most beautiful covering a definition of what theorists do when they theorize, saying that the theorists are first and foremost conceptualizers, symbolizers, synthesizers, and abstract organizers. And what they have been doing as theorists is painting for us in their writings bold-stroked, broad brush pictures of social reality and telling us that the real world is their pictures. It is as good as it gets when it comes to define the process of theorizing, in my view. And that is what I suggest that we engage in. The good news is that I, on a previous occasion, produced a guide to creative theorizing. So you can find that in my textbook, A New Introduction. And when I have the opportunity, this is something that I encourage my students to do. And at first, of course, they are very reluctant to do so because they've never been told to do so before. I encourage them even more, and they sort of understand that they are in a situation to which they cannot escape. So they begin to theorize. Usually the time is limited, so what comes out of it is maybe not very sophisticated, but at least they get this idea that actually they can theorize. And how is it that they do it? Well, what does the manual tell them to do? They say that, okay, let's first be deconstructive. Let's tear apart a given theory and see of what it is composed, similar to butchering a deer into different parts. You can also butcher a theory. Any theory that you choose, you can butcher into its key components, its building blocks. And then, of course, that is not theorizing. That is understanding what goes into a given theory. The difficult part comes when these different building blocks are put together in a new fashion, and in a fashion that is relevant for the world we see out there and the world we expect to be around in the near future. There are quite a few building blocks, too many to get into detail here. My point is that you can find out easily what a theory consists of, and then you can also begin to put the components back together. First attempts are maybe not compelling, but you can enter into some group work. A group of creative theorizers can really have some fun in putting together a new theory. It might not be fundamentally different from what exists already, but it might be more relevant for understanding the world as it is right now. Then, of course, as I emphasized time and again, liberal IIER theorists are not alone in the world. They are full of, they are bound to encounter critique, also tension, but they are bound to be contested because other scholars come from different perspectives. They have other orientations, they have other preferences. And this is just to show that there is in a discipline necessarily an ongoing discussion or debate about what is the best to understand, what is the best theory around right now, and what is it that characterizes this theory or this theoretical tradition. This figure focuses on traditions, but again, you can branch out any of these traditions into currents of thinking and distinct theories. No problem. That is perfectly possible. So I think with this, I have said enough, and I would like to thank you for your attention. And I will proceed and not share the screen any longer. Then I hope we can do the Q&A without the shared screen.
Thank you so much, Professor Jørgensen, for this great presentation. You traveled us to the fascinating world of IIER theory that we're also so much interested in. In my turn, picking up from where you left, and since we are focusing on liberalism, on the liberal tradition in Europe, you spoke about the predicaments, and I would like to bring to everybody's attention how liberalism is facing predicaments that are challenging its foundations and also are challenging the liberal international order and challenging the West itself. So this discussion is very timely and it is very important, not just to save the West, but also to create an alternative paradigm that may have the potential of saving our world, especially with the rise of AI in the future. So we see that we have the rise of populism and nationalism, we have power shifts, and as you very well said, multipolarity that challenge global power dynamics, and the rise of new economic and political powers. So all these challenge the liberal assumptions, despite the fact that they increase economic interdependence, that many people think that it leads to peace. We have an ongoing criticism of global institutions, and we saw that especially after the pandemic. And we see how liberalism relies on international institutions to manage global affairs. But these institutions, such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, WTO, face criticism for insufficient lack of representation and failures to address contemporary challenges adequately. So this undermines the liberal vision of cooperative global governance. Also, we have many security challenges that probably maybe traditional liberal theories struggle to explain, and this adds to the problem of not being so much widespread as a tradition in Europe, despite the fact that it stems from Europe. The environmental concerns you mentioned about sharing the planet, the global environment crisis, which raises questions about the ability of liberal institutions to address transnational challenges efficiently. Of course, there is always cultural relativism and identity politics and technological disruptions, the rapid advancement of technology and its impact on communication, surveillance, the warfare that raises new challenges for liberal principles, such as privacy rights and the regulation of emerging technologies. And we see that in all those domains, the European Union today is trying to build its own agenda. It tries to contribute to a global governance agenda in order to address those transnational issues that affect from the micro to the macro every actor and community. But if we want to focus in Europe, we also see that there is a contradiction, drawing again from your own scholarship, between the different models that are trying to prevail in Europe. For example, we had this debate about the four models: Europe, thin, thick, parochial, and global, and then the foreign policy paradigms that it wants to project into the world, especially when internally Europe is experiencing such disconnect in many areas. So these are my humble comments in order to foster in order to broaden the discussion, drawing upon Professor Jørgensen's lecture. And at this point, I would like to open the floor to questions, and I hope we will have a very fruitful discussion. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and you can open your camera and your microphone. I don't see any raised hands, so I'm not sure if there are no questions or people are shy.
Yes, do they exist? Hello?
Yes, please.
Hello, I can't, I'm a bit confused by this whole digital business, but I have to say that one of the few very good books I ever read was as mentioned by Mr. Jørgensen, who is a fantastic man who's almost drowned himself in reading, was Diplomatic Investigations, written in the 60s by historians and others, famous people, Hedley Bull, Howard Martin White, etc. Now, my final conclusion and question is, would you and other people on this panel agree that it was the introduction of normative theory which began to destroy coherent thinking, I stress, on interstate relations? And by the way, I'm an ex-British diplomat as well. I should have introduced myself. And I've just written a book for Palgrave Macmillan, published, attacking the geopolitics and theory. And I have to say, essentially, that once I have to use a strong word, the poison of normative stuff was put in to the logical attempt to understand relations between states, you know, Aberystwyth 1919 and all that, that things became increasingly confused. And what I see when I look at the clash between behavioralists and realists, the whole thing becomes like in a sense, a reflection of the current chaos we've got in the world. You have, you know, structuralism, modernization theory, dependent theory, world systems analysis, positivism, constructivism, postmodernism, normative, pluralism, functionalism, pluralism, and they all clash with each other. They have their subdivisions. And I think it's been agreed, and that's why I'm impressed by Mr. Jørgensen, that it is actually very, very confusing for logical thinkers. I have to say that. And so that's one reason why I think it's time, if ever possible, remembering that even the word liberalism is bad these days because it's ordo-liberalism and even incipient fascism in some ways, believe it or not. And one wonders whether it's time simply to concentrate on the individual human being as the essential starting point of any attempt to understand why we are in current chaos. And the second question arises, is the chaos a reflection of the reality of the behavior of the human race? Or is it the other way around? Which is the chicken and which is the egg? I stress again that as far as I'm concerned, everything begins with the individual. That then becomes the group. And the group then becomes the corporate entity, which eventually can finish as the state. For me, the only clean definition and starting point, given that background, can be the state, because the state is unemotional. The concept should not be ideological, which is what affects all of us. And that's from where I think it should begin. And that's why I speak as a simple historian, because I've never seen such manipulation of history, such cherry picking of history in my life as with IIER theory. We need the theory. Otherwise, we're dead. We're robots. Of course, we need the theory. But at the end of the day, it has to be back to the simple, unemotional basics of the state and the relations between those states, which encompasses everything. It's no good, saying one theory is better than another, or one sub-theory is better than another sub-theory, all clashing with each other. So the point now is, if we look at the world at this very moment, where do we begin? Again, I say the individual, the anthropology, because that leaves out any ideological emotion, because ideology is the enemy of rational thinking. Ideology is laden with emotion. It's laden with human characteristics. You leave that, forget it. Pure chaos. In a way, the current chaos, and this is conspiracy theory, I will grant you, the current chaos may be a reflection of a very cynical group of what I call geopolitical people, simply understanding that in order to control, you need to confuse. And this is reflected in the academic world as well as the real world. I'm sorry to sound so negative, But what Mr. Jørgensen said impressed me so much, and I realized so much the clashes in his own mind about a solution, that I was inspired to tell you this. I will do not wish to promote my book, but it is Palgrave Macmillan. It came out recently, and believe it or not, it's called Guicciardini, Geopolitics and Geohistory, Understanding Interstate Relations. It's far better than Machiavelli, Guicciardini. And he was my starting point for my current thinking. Now, if the nice Mr. Jørgensen gives me his email, I will send him that book free of charge.
Okay.
So down in the message, and then I've said enough and too much.
Yeah.
But really, I hope you understand, as an ex-diplomat, the way I think, leave out the ideology and the emotions, and we may have a starting point.
Okay, thank you so much.
God bless you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. Professor Jørgensen, would you like to address?
Yes, because, well, first of all, yes, you're all welcome to write to me. My email address is now in the chat. About Williams's comments, I want to maybe summarize in 3 different points. First of all, one book that I like very much is a book where scholars from different disciplines get together and discuss how and why they consider the very same global topics so differently. It's a group of historians and it's a group of international relations scholars. And clearly, the way in which both groups are trained prompt them to sort of emphasize different things and do things differently. So it's edited by Lee Ellman and Ellman, and is highly recommended in order to understand, or if one wants to understand why it is that people from different disciplines sometimes talk past each other. There can be very good reasons to talk past each other, especially if you don't want to understand. But if you really want to understand somebody in the other camp, then this book is certainly a very, very valuable. Second point, yes, the Diplomatic Investigations from the mid-1960s is a wonderful book. And it is, as you know, it is the outcome of the first outcome, I believe, from the Committee of International Relations program in Britain.
Can I ring you in a few minutes?
Mr. David, please turn your microphone on. Off, excuse me.
I'll have to go out of the room and leave the meeting. Christ, thank you. No, it's too late. Okay.
Κύριε Πολάλη, μπορείτε να του κλείσετε. Okay. I'm sorry, Professor Jørgensen, please.
No problem. So diplomatic investigations, yes, the first published outcome in a book form from the Committee of International Relations, again funded by the Rockefeller Foundation as a kind of British outlet from the American committee, which produced the book I showed a picture of before, edited by William Fox. And that is interesting because of its origin. I guess the process through which this came into being was a dissatisfaction among a group of British scholars about how increasingly sterile the tension or contestation between realism and liberalism had become. So let's tried with this book and other publications to put in sort of a third perspective. This is at a time when things were simple. There were only 2 competing perspectives, and then a third one was introduced to sort of be a via media, a middle position. The funny thing or interesting thing is that when the authors in the diplomatic investigations refer back to political philosophers, they only refer back to liberal philosophers from the 17th, 18th century. So there is a kind of loadedness in their leanings. But of course, when one tries to take two perspectives into consideration, then the different dimensions that you take on can be sort of weighed differently. And I guess this is what characterizes the balance that you find in diplomatic investigations. So yes, that's how that's some of the ideas popped up in my mind when I listened to William David's comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, Professor Eichwein. Professor Eichwein, I think you wanted to speak.
Hey, no, I didn't raise my hands. Not so far.
Oh,
maybe later.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
I think Semitis.
Valasi, please. Yeah, okay. Valasi?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Good evening. Greetings to everyone. Thank you, Professor, for your insightful lecture. My question addresses a personal concern regarding the international system, which tends to fragmentation, especially with the rise of far-right populist parties worldwide. Can the IIER liberal theory contribute to avoid this trend, let's say? And if yes, how? Maybe with the enhancement of the research in liberal theory? Thank you.
Maybe one can say that, well, the prime task of a scientific theory is to function as a tool for scholars who are doing analytical work that is based on evidence. So it's sort of the steering system of an empirical investigation. So in that sense, a theory is kind of agnostic about the political forces out in the world, whether it's far left, far right, far middle, far whatever. Then, of course, it can be that the analysis that scholars produce can have an impact in society. After all, if you take the quintessential liberal theory of European integration, Ernest Haas, for example, he was sort of very eager to take out from the equation the notion of national interest. And he was also very eager to point to the potential benefits of European integration, benefits to various segments in European society. Now, if that had an impact on politics, I think that is very hard to tell, but his thinking had kind of parallels within the world of politics, in the sense that some of the politicians at the time shared Ernest B. Haas's outlook, his understanding, interpretation of what is important and what's valuable in European society. You can also say that some theories sort of work to the benefit of some social forces. For a liberal theory of, I mean, we are meeting in the context of an institute of international economic relations. So a liberal theory that is sort of in favor of globalization might have might promote some of the benefits that the enemies of globalization really are eager to highlight. So I'm, on the one hand, a little bit reluctant to say that there is a direct and mechanical causal effect from theory to impact on society, including the politics of society. But at the other hand, I don't want to exclude at all that there are some interaction between theoretical reflections and sort of the state of affairs in the world. I guess that is also why you find, for example, some of the most pronounced theorists of multilateralism, Cohen and Nye, writing books and articles about what multilateralism is, how it has evolved over time. But at the same time, you can find articles by the very same two authors where they, in the title, say 2 cheers for multilateralism, because they are in favor of multilateralism sort of developing, thriving, getting better. So probably in many minds of a theorist, there are also political concerns, and maybe sometimes that is the driving factor. That is what motivates engagement in theory. I can see that in some of the prefaces of books, some authors point to some real-world events, developments, as the key motivation factor for them writing a sometimes highly sophisticated, highly abstract book. So this interplay between theoretical abstract reflection and real-world developments, I think, is truly fascinating. So it's not something that one should neglect. On the contrary, one should be more conscious about how one has an impact on the other and vice versa.
Thank you, Professor Jørgensen. Dr. Tsartanidis would like to ask a question or would like to comment. Professor Tsartanidis?
No, I have a question, but my connection is very poor. So if I am lucky, I'll ask him. Professor Jørgensen, you mentioned in your presentation eclecticism, and I would like to ask, do you consider eclecticism as a helpful tool for theorizing, or it is much more useful from a methodological point of view? In other words, is it possible with eclecticism to help ourselves for building up some elements of theory and to mix up, perhaps to make something new? Because for me, it's much more useful as a methodological, analytical eclecticism. I mean, has proposed that.
Thank you very much for a very difficult and highly relevant question. I see a role of eclecticism in terms of both theory and analysis. I think that Peter Katzenstein has demonstrated time and again that eclecticism in terms of analysis can actually produce something very valuable, some insights where thinking outside the box is actually helpful. Of course, eclecticism can also produce totally incoherent results. So there's no guarantee that it turns out to be something that is valuable. When it concerns eclecticism in theory, then I think that, and here I step outside my scope of liberal international theory, but it seems to me that the English school is one prime example of a successful attempt at eclecticism in incorporating both realist and liberal components. Of course, you can easily, and many people have done so, they have sort of criticized the English school for being eclectic, for being incoherent, because how does it hang together if it does? Also, you can look at one of the most celebrated books coming out in the 1990s, Alexander Wentz's Social Theory of International Politics, which is basically Kenneth Walls in a social constructivist key. Even in the title, the prime publication of Kenneth Walls was Theory of International Politics. So the only thing that Alexander Wendt did was to add social to that title. And that is a small addition, but with very, very big consequences. Because certainly the actors in the state system are social. They do not just sort of they are sort of beyond the mechanical. They can actually think, they can reflect, they can speak. They're not mute. So again, eclecticism can produce some very fine results. And again, the result is not given. And it's a very, very difficult exercise, I believe, to engage in, because everything can go wrong. And there are many examples of that also happening for scholars. And then they do not end up with a famous book or famous article, but they end up with something that is sometimes cited only because it's wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. There is a question in the chat by Eduardo Lavezzo. In regards of the IIER theory, could a neoclassical realist approach be considered as a valid alternative that combines other theories' elements? And he is referring to ideational factors, leadership, governance, foreign policy behavior, agents and structures about multilateralism or bilateralism.
Classical realism. Again, a question that is outside the scope, but nonetheless, I have also at various points of time considered the realist tradition. Actually, when I wrote my PhD, I drew on neo-realism in a reconstructed fashion, the Barry Busan version. Remember, once upon a time, Barry Busan was a neo-realist. Then he changed his mind and became an English school scholar. But classical realism, if that can be considered eclecticism because it pulls together many different strings, I guess the argument can be made because it is certainly not, it is certainly not coherent. It is, of course, the concept of national interest plays a big role. Power politics, same thing. And the state is in the center of it all. States people are not so pronounced, so valuable in that regard, but nonetheless, they're not totally out of the question. So there is a certain focus in classical realism. At the same time, it sort of branches out in many different, sometimes very individual, personal varieties. So if you compare E.H. Carr to Morgenthau, or if you compare to Mr. Fox, Professor Fox, that I mentioned before, if you take in Wolfgang Wolfers, the migrant scholar coming from Europe and settling in the United States, then yes, they emphasize different things. And you can criticize each of them for what they emphasize. You can say, like Ernest Haas in his criticism, that the balance of power is a hopeless concept because it means 13 different things to 13 different people. I think he was wrong in that, but what he wanted to emphasize is that maybe at the time people paid too much attention to the balance of power.
And what about neoclassical realism?
Then neoclassical, yeah, okay. Thank you for reminding me. Yes.
Much discussion these days.
The neoclassical realism is, in my not too friendly interpretation, kind of reinventing the wheels. Because it wants to say, we want to do both third image theory second image theory, and third and first image theory. And maybe that is possible to do, but then you can explain everything and thereby not too much, at least not in a compelling fashion. So I think that is, in my view, but again, that might be seen as an unfriendly interpretation. I don't see it as sort of a big step forward. It's also just to irritate our good friend Alex Reichwein.
Yeah, thank you. I will make some minds and come back later on this point, okay?
Let me. I checked if there is a question by the audience, but since there is no question, I have a question, Professor Jørgensen. I was actually wondering, I was thinking the other day, as you know, I'm working with alternative theories, borrowing from the natural sciences, trying to develop a meta theory. And I came across so many epistemological problems. And since we're having this discussion today, I was thinking, what about the epistemological problems associated with liberal international relations theory? And if this is the problem actually for not being so abandoned, let's say, in texts about European theory and in the European tradition. Like, for example, there are some assumptions about rationality in which liberalism often assumes that states and actors behave rationally in pursuing their interests. And then critics argue that this assumption oversimplifies decision-making processes, maybe neglects a role of emotions and non-rational factors, and may not accurately capture the complexity of international relations. Then I was thinking, what about universalism and cultural biases, or the overemphasis on state centrism that we see it with strands of liberalism? Your example about the tree with the branches was excellent. And there is a problem with market fundamentalism and neglect of power dynamics. And especially now with the rise of AI, how can we actually advance the research program, of liberalism, if we are not able to create innovations in it in order to overcome those epistemological problems that are directly connected with the changes that are taking place in our world? And if we want to take it a step further, since we're discussing about the European Union, we see that there's so much concentration on a technocratic European Union and also the advancement of technology. It is trying to project a global image, then it has so many problems, internal problems, and there is these models, as you state, in foreign policy paradigms, this collusion of models that are contradicting actually, and they do not allow liberalism to flourish, especially when European Union wants to project its foreign policies and other agendas in parts of the world where liberalism is not so popular or will never become popular, like, for example, in China, if we exclude trade. I don't want to go on, but I'm just having these questions about the epistemological problems, if you would like to elaborate.
I would love to elaborate because, as it happens, one of my very first papers was on the epistemological and ontological dimensions of the study of European foreign policy, which I presented in 1992 in Heidelberg in Germany. And to which one of the very experienced professors commented, in his view, it was sort of slightly idiomatic. I took that as sort of a praise. It was not meant as such, but I took it as such. And my take on epistemology is that it's important. It is important how we can know things, the process through which we can know things. And that is what epistemology is all about. But epistemology might be slightly overrated. At least before we get to how we can know things, we need to pay much more attention to the things that we want to know something about. And that is the ontological dimension. Maybe I'm sort of perpetually impacted by listening to and reading the philosopher John Searle. In the mid-90s, he published a book about the social construction of the construction of social reality. And that is basically one long defense of ontology being the first thing we should focus on. As he several times points out in that book, Mount Everest, the mountain, doesn't care about what we call it and how we understand it. The important thing for Mount Everest is that it exists. It has an existence. So without the existence, then we would try to understand non-existing things. Of course, here he refers to material reality, a mountain. It's way more difficult when it comes to social reality. All these things that only exist because we agree that they do. And that's where the problem with ontology, social ontology, that is, comes into the equation. But in my view, many tend to jump to epistemology before they really have been clarified for themselves the ontology with which they are working. And all sorts of problems for that reason occur. So I think that is sort of the best way forward. It is to, before you jump to the different epistemologies, the different formula that exist for how we can gain knowledge about things, it is to understand the things. And we can, it is to conceptualize them, it is to understand that they can, that the very same thing means different things to different people. And to some people, something is important, and to other people, it's not. About the IA, I see that as sort of plagiarism authorized. Because what does AI know? Existing knowledge. But there are never references in IA responses. I haven't asked AI if they would like to give references to the answers that are provided. And I haven't tried out too many times to many different topics. But so far, I've not seen any references to anything. But it's all knowledge that has been stolen from what is in the storage, in the servers of where the AI is being hosted. So I think that is maybe, and now increasingly, it will be allowed to use by students for exams. It will be to sort of accept them become copyists. Because yes, they can do very much. It's very useful in many, many different ways. Absolutely, I get that. I'm fully in favor of it. But as always, when there is a technological fix to something, it comes with some prices. And the price here, I think, is very, very heavy. Also, we have been talking about eclecticism and sort of extreme positions. What you get when you get an answer for, typically from an AI, is always mid-range. So if you stuffed an AI with realism and liberalism, it would produce English school. Okay, that was done by human minds and brains, but I think that is what would be sort of the machine answer. But it's, yes, it's a fantastic tool for experiments, but not as knowledge production, because AI knows nothing except what is stored.
But aren't middle range theories better for foreign policy paradigms in this day and age? No?
Not by
With this
default.
complexity? No, you think no?
No. I mean, the world is not more complex today than it was 100 years ago. It's just more complex for us because we now live in this world. Whereas those people who experienced the rapidly changing times around 1900, it was a hyper-complex world. It was that was the reason that geopolitical thinking came into being. That geography and politics certainly became interweaved to a degree that it was never before.
So do you think that there is a tension between the different branches of liberalism that actually does not allow it to become, to create those innovations in its structure that will lead it into the future successfully? Like, for example, there is always, as we experience the tension between embedded liberalism and it's replaced by economic neoliberalism. This creates internal tensions. What is the future of liberal institutionalism and liberal internationalism? Would you like to comment on that?
I can recommend you to read or reread Cohen's article from 1988 or the book from 1989, where he sort of introduces the neoliberal institutionalism. What he does in that context is to introduce what he calls a perspective, not a theory, but a perspective, a theoretical perspective. And he does so by saying that, I don't subscribe, at least I don't subscribe any longer to commerce liberalism, that a trade is necessarily producing peace. And he doesn't also subscribe to the governance version, where certain governance versions are producing states that are more peace-minded than others. He sort of waves goodbye to those two previous pronounced liberal currents of thinking, and then he elevates his own to sort of the new paradigm. Of course, he didn't succeed in people giving up or following him. He got some followers for sure, but many continue to cultivate commerce or interdependence liberalism. And others, the democratic peace theory is for sure not dead, but very much alive and kicking, at least in some corners. So yes, there is for sure very strong tensions between the different currents of thinking within the liberal family, within the liberal tradition. And to some degree, this is how a theoretical tradition actually evolves over time. It is in competition with competing traditions, but it is also by means of internal competition. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the new products are better capable of addressing contemporary world affairs. That was the case when interdependence liberalism or transnationalism was introduced in the 1970s. But I'm not sure that, Cohen's next engagement after interdependence liberalism was to look into game theory, because he found that beautifully simple in its construction. And of course it is beautifully simple. That's the benefits of it. But soon after he gave up and said, I'm not sort of minded for using game theory in the context of international relations. So even in the very same individual scholar or theorist, you can see a development from different positions over time. So sometimes individuals are in a kind of tension with themselves. And I guess that is both interesting in itself, but actually I think it's better for people, scholars, to be in that way compared to the opposite, where one young mind, say a 19-year-old woman, decides that I will forever be of a certain theoretical orientation. And 60 years later, she retires and has been that all her life. That has been her professional identity. That is really, really sort of a scary example.
Mm-hmm. And I think this was the point that created tensions with Nye's theory, right? When Keohane developed this theory that created tensions with the transnational theory that Nye had created, where he was advocating actually that the United States will be the global superpower. Well, of course, he was right, but after that, we saw the emergence of the multipolar system. If there's no other question, I don't see any hand raised and no questions in the chat. You had an excellent paper produced with Ashley Jorgensen, and I had written the names of the two other co-authors here. I apologize for not having them handy right now. I believe one was Professor Frank, Liv Frank, and Lara Landroth. And you were discussing foreign policy paradigms, and you were developing this conceptual framework about identity, values, goals, and principles. Would you like to discuss a little bit about that and how maybe this could be a framework that could help to update, to create innovations, not only, and maybe alleviate those tensions, not only inside liberalism, but also in other traditions, like, for example, neoclassical realism, that is also trying to find a basis, a foundation to flourish.
Thank you very much. Before I get to the policy paradigms, let me just make a few comments on Joseph Nye, which I think is a grossly underrated scholar. When his good colleague and friend, Robert Keohane, developed neoliberal institutionalism, Joseph Nye was the first to realize and point out that there is such a thing as the neo-synthesis. Mm-hmm. Because Keohane's neoliberalism and Kenneth Walsh's neorealism were almost identical, except for a few minor details. They had the same ontological foundation, they had the same epistemological approach, and the realization, I guess Joseph Nye was sort of following Keohane's development. So for that reason, he published very rapidly his observations about this neo-synthesis, which he was the first to observe. But you also see that the two parted ways in terms of assessing the situation in which the United States found itself. In the mid-1980s, after hegemony, that is Keohane's title, after hegemony. That's a strong, bold title, because his argument is that the United States has lost its dominant position, its hegemony. And for that reason, he's sort of trying to explain why it is that the world hangs together nonetheless. 5 years later, Joe Nye responded in a sense by publishing Bound to Lead. He said, after hegemony, lost dominance, lost hegemony. Wrong, just wrong, big error. The United States is bound to lead. And what did the United States do then for 15 years? It was leading the world, because this was the unipolar moment, as others would call it. Now, about the policy paradigm, this is, of course, a completely different ball game. It is actually an illustration of the importance of paying attention to ontology. Because when you hear the term paradigm, you're thinking about Thomas Kuhn. Not you, but people in general.
And Karl Popper. and Karl Popper.
Mm. And let a policy paradigm has nothing with Thomas Kuhn and his paradigms at all to do. A policy paradigm is a certain level of reflection among policymakers about the world and about the situation in which the country is situated, or for that reason, or for that matter, European Union. Also, the European Union is situated in a certain situation and in a certain world, and policymakers try to understand what they can do given that things are as they are. So a policy paradigm is foremost a piece of ontology. It is, of course, also interpretation. What do we know about the world? Because they might interpret the world wrong. But for us, scholars who want to understand the dynamics of foreign policy making, which was the topic of that article by the four of us, is to understand not policies as such. There are way too many articles about European foreign policy and foreign policy as such. But what is missing is really some of the deeper structures of thinking among policymakers. How they conceive their options for action, and how they. So it's if epistemology is important here, then it is the epistemological perspectives that policymakers put on themselves and the context in which they are operating. Whereas for us scholars, policy paradigms, the outcome of the policymakers' reflections, and become a part of social reality. And social reality is ontological. I think when you ask about how it connects with neoclassical realism, I think I still have to see a neoclassical realist talk about policy paradigms. They prefer different language for something that is more or less the same. So they would like to talk about grand strategy, but not policy paradigms. So they use a different concept for more or less the same thing. And of course, there are quite a few neoclassical realists who have written interesting things about grand strategy. Typically, it is the grand strategy of their own country. And given that most neoclassical realists are Americans, it is about American grand strategy, not Chinese or Russian or Brazilian or European Union. So, I mean, if they even sort of recognize the European Union as an international actor. And that is...
Could we say that point? Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm sorry. Please.
No, go ahead.
No, I was thinking, could we say in this point that maybe Talaferos and Ripsman model about intervening variables in neoclassical realism is the sort of eclecticism you are talking about that maybe is missing from the neoclassical realists who are preoccupied with grand strategy? Because they're touching upon almost constructivist values, the same way you are touching on the foreign policy paradigms, like identity values. So it incorporates also liberal elements. And we see again this pluralism of the newest strands of IIER theory in various research programs that are trying to incorporate elements from adjacent theories in order to develop those innovations that will make them last the test of time. So we're coming back to second image theorizing. This is the main it seems to me that both in liberalism and neoclassical realism, even neorealism is the second image theorizing. That is the main preoccupation nowadays. What is your comment on that? And if you think that this is right or wrong?
No, I think there's very much to it. And you can also see, I hope that we, in that article that you have looked into, I hope that we actually cited George Kennan. Not that he is a neoclassical realist, he is very much classical if he's anything. And one of his very, very good sort of late articles is about, basically, I guess it's a speech turned into an article, and the speech was on the occasion of his, I think, 19th birthday, where somebody threw him a party and he stood up and gave a talk. So what he emphasized in that context is that the United States is missing something. It's not policies, not at all. People should sort of, for some time, they should maybe lower the focus on policies. But what the United States needs are principles. And principles very much connect to grand strategy and to policy paradigms. So here you see, in that context, sort of an operational analysis of, in Kennan's view, of an error or an illness in American discourse and in American preoccupations about policies. So we are very much inspired by his article. And in a sense, we are trying to do something similar for European foreign policy. Because yes, there are full libraries of articles and books about European foreign policy, but there's hardly any about European foreign policy paradigms. This is strange because at least we would expect a certain linkage between how a paradigm is in substantive terms and how given policies then evolve, sometimes caused by the paradigms, sometimes in opposition to it. About the second image, I think you are right on target. It's a very, very popular approach where you take the character of a state and then you predict kind of its behavior. That is, I guess, the second image model in a nutshell. And you see that applied to almost all states around the world. You also see it applied to the European Union. Because one of my slides, I didn't show it today, but there's one slide I'm really fond of showing people, is where I have 21 different versions of Power Europe. Normative Power Europe, Civilian Power Europe, Ethical Power Europe, what's not Power Europe. And that is basically an argument in each article about the European Union is so and so, and for that reason, the European Union is bound to have a certain foreign policy of that sort. You also see it in those who argue that the European Union is an empire, and because the European Union is an empire, the European Union is bound to behave as empires did, that is, in a colonial imperialistic fashion. So it is a very, very popular perspective on, in this case, European foreign policy.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Maybe Alex, would you like to comment? Like on all this discussion, we discussed a little bit about neoclassical realism, classical realism. I'm sure you have a lot to say. Would you like to interject? No, Alex? He cannot hear me. Professor Eichwein?
I'm traveling. I can't speak. I just can listen. Sorry.
Okay. If there is no other question, would you like to discuss a little bit about the future of the liberal international order? That is, I mean, I feel it is directly connected to the future of the liberal tradition, liberal IR theorizing.
Well, I guess the first contribution that, what I try to emphasize in my talk is that a theoretical tradition, if it is dynamic and living, it needs to be reproduced. If nobody are around or very few are around to reproduce it, it will sort of lose its position and it might sort of die out, dry out. One way in which it could make itself relevant is first of all to kill the expression conceptually at least, the concept of the international liberal order. Because it seems to me that that concept is doing more harm than good. The international order has never been liberal. It was something that people began to call the international order when there was no sort of big contestation right after the end of the Cold War, when everything seemed to turn in a fashion a la Fukuyama and the end of history. But the international order, if thereby we mean the system of states, and I guess that is usually what we have in mind when we talk about international order, is inhabited by almost 200 different units, which we call states. There are maybe 20, 30, max 40 of those states that can be called liberal. And they don't characterize the order. There is a lot of non-liberal elements in that international order that had existed also during the time where people call it the international order, the liberal international order. So it's a kind of a misnomer. You could just as well call it the international liberal order during the 1930s, because after all, there were United Kingdom and United States and a few other states that could be called liberal. But it was not what characterized the international order at that time. And it's not what has characterized the international order during the last 30 years. It's also a little bit like when, during the Cold War, people began to talk about the West. The West was invented for that alliance of Western powers that were not of a communist orientation. Subsequently, we also had non-aligned neutral states as a sort of third category. But it was basically to claim a certain coherence among the West. But the West was really a very, very incoherent grouping. And if you just look at NATO, NATO is supposed to be the alliance, defense alliance of the West, of the democratic world. But for strategic reasons, not particularly democratic states such as Portugal was a member of NATO for most of the Cold War, or during most of the Cold War. It didn't really sort of harm the expression, but it was mainly sort of an ideological construct. The country in which I am currently living and currently sitting has perhaps never been particularly liberal, but it was nonetheless part of NATO, the defender of the democratic world, the liberal world. So it's a misnomer, and if we can sort of cancel liberal of international order, it would be better. And it would be better for liberal theory to do that as maybe the first. This, of course, is connected with sort of you can say it, the richness of the liberal international theory tradition, which I start off with, all the varieties, which is reflected in the world of politics. And one of the most sort of enlightening books I've been reading for a long time is a book by Jeffrey Frieden and some of his colleagues, where he traced the origin of liberal politics in Europe during the 19th century and into the 20th century. And in their view, that liberalism is so diverse internally that they insist of talking about liberalisms in the plural in the title of their book. Because what was Spanish liberalism was certainly very different from Scandinavian or German or French or British, or you can continue with a long list. So liberalism is just it's not just one thing, and that also applies in the world of theory. It's a very diverse world, but I guess the if you look in some terms of process, I think what liberal scholars of a liberal orientation could do is to both sort of develop the box in which they are situated. Could be democratic peace theory, it could be European integration theory, it could be interdependence theory. So they should continue to cultivate their own box or their own garden, but at the same time recognize that they are part of a family or a theoretical tradition, and they actually share something, and they share something more than they share with some competing traditions. So they should have a very thriving internal discussion, and they should have a very thriving discussion or debate with competing theoretical perspectives. But we have not had that much in Europe. We don't we tend not to read each other's books when we are in different camps. Then we just sort of look at our own garden and we disregard the rest, both sort of consciously, but also most of the time unconsciously. And I think that's a big mistake, because it's during the debates that you actually trigger the dynamism. And the dynamism is essential for keeping a theoretical tradition alive and kicking and relevant.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Professor Jørgensen? I see no questions. I have one last question. Would you like to comment a little bit about the methodologies were used? Like, for example, within the democratic peace theory, there is a huge quantitativist school. We saw so many projects, the cow project, the ICOW project, for which I have actually worked. And that's where IIER is actually becoming scientific. Then we have different other methodological schools that are trying to interject in the research program. Do you feel that there should be methodological pluralism? Do you feel that maybe the quantitativists have taken it so very far to the detriment of maybe the philosophical paradigm that is trying to still emerge out of this research program? What is your opinion on that?
I guess my opinion is sort of slightly harsh in the sense that I see a clear hierarchy. I think, in my view, it seems to me that everything should begin with getting ontology right. Once ontology has been fully comprehended of sort of the phenomenon that you want to understand, then you can consider epistemology. And once those two meta-theoretical dimensions are fully clarified, then you can see, okay, given my focal points on ontology and epistemology, what are my theoretical choices? What are the different options? And usually there's a whole range of options that sort of avail themselves to be employed. Once you then have decided upon a given theory, or if you are sort of doing a multi-theoretical comparative analysis of a given empirical phenomenon, then it's time to consider methodology. But that is sort of the end of the chain. Whereas for sort of what I sometimes call methodologists, they begin with methodology and think that is the first thing that should be addressed. So I put it upside down and say, not at all. You can get into all sorts of inconsistencies if you begin with methodology and to think that you have always the best hammer in the world, to which the rest of the world is just to be hammered. So ontology, epistemology, theory, methodology. That would be my my hierarchy, my pyramid of what's very important and less important. Then I'm fully in favor of, then I'm fully in favor of those who then try to do multi-method approaches, because there you see sort of, at least you give, at least you have the possibility of seeing the comparative advantages and weaknesses of choosing one methodology towards another one.
Mm-hmm. The reason I asked that is because, in my view, there should be an attempt to reconcile liberalism with the research program of Global IIER, because in many instances, liberalism is considered as a perpetuation of the colonial paradigm, especially when it interjects in the EU foreign policy paradigms. I had this criticism. I have heard this criticism. So I was thinking that maybe there should be developed a novel methodological program that could help liberalism reconcile those tensions with research programs in Global IIER. I don't know if you have any. I'm sorry, I couldn't express it very well. I don't know if you have a comment on that before we let you go.
I think that all the major theoretical traditions have something to contribute worldwide. That applies to the liberal tradition. It also applies to the realist tradition, to the tradition of international political economy. None of these are weighing the dice in a Western-friendly direction. The argument in, say, democratic peace theory is that it's very valuable for a state to be democratic, not least for its neighbors, because then that state is more peace-minded, provided that the other states, neighboring states, are also democratic. That applies, that is highly relevant to most of the global south, where the development of democratic states would be a big advantage, a big step forward. And for that reason, democratic peace theory is as relevant for the global south as it is for the west or the global north. I can also see that there is a lot of relevance for the realist tradition, even if the realist tradition is sort of reflecting the European historical experience of power politics and balance of power. Because throughout the world, you have all sorts of balances of power. You have all sorts of power politics being played out. That applies as much to Africa as to Asia and to the Americas, both North and South. If you sort of look into the current security situation in the Far East, you will see that it is highly, highly unstable. All states feel insecure. There is power politics par excellence. And the realist paradigm, or the realist tradition, is eminently suited to explain power politics among states. So I don't see it as I don't see the traditions as being developed in the West and therefore non-applicable to the rest of the world. Sometimes they maybe have to be translated because, well, there are also Chinese scholars, philosophers, there are Indian scholars and philosophers who in historical times have been thinking something very much along both realist and liberal orientations. So sometimes you have to, instead of talk about the 25 Western IR theorists, you have to sort of discover your own sources. And it is for that reason I insisted at the beginning that I'm talking about what comes out of Europe. I'm not talking about what comes out of other continents, because that is also interesting and it's also relevant, but you have to focus on something. And I've seen some of these attempts being conducted. For example, here in Turkey, there are some attempts from time to time at Bilkent University to sort of reconsider how international relations as a discipline has evolved in Turkey. Who are the theorizers? What did they focus on? Which orientation did they have and why did they have it? How did they interrelate? How was the interplay between themselves? And I think that is highly, that is very, very fruitful. I think they are currently in a process similarly in the Philippines, where international relations has been sort of more more developed within the framework of a relatively newly set up international association. In Japan, of course, it's well known that there are at least 5 different theoretical traditions that have nothing to do with the West, but has been grown sort of in a Japanese garden. But of course, it's not something that we pay too much attention to here, because how much can we cope with? We can cope with maybe our own state, our own continent, or maybe the transatlantic area, which is sort of the heartland of where we are engaged. I've been to way more conferences in the United States compared to Japan. I've never been to Latin America, so I cannot possibly sort of take on Latin American insights, except when I meet scholars and have good discussions with them. For example, in this future conference that is organized in Warsaw, the WISC, the World International Studies Committee conference, where there is the aspiration to actually bring together the world, at least every 4 years. And that has been participating in all these conferences ever since they started back in 2005 in Istanbul. So I've been to Taiwan, I've been various places in Europe. I unfortunately couldn't go to Buenos Aires, but very few could because of the COVID pandemic. So yes, you can broaden your horizons, and I think there's all sorts of good reasons to do so. But again, we have all limited time, so sometimes we can only care about our own garden, small or big.
Do you have an advice? We have many students in the audience, but also scholars and accomplished professors who are doing IR theory. Do you have an advice for all of us who are lovers of IR theory and would like to develop the field further, especially for the students in our audience?
Well, I just suggest that you do as I preached in the talk, namely try to disintegrate a given theory, see how is it actually composed, how is it constructed, and subsequently try to put together the components again for yourself or in teams. It's a highly, highly stimulating and actually fun exercise. And I can only sort of encourage you to encourage your teachers to allow you to do so, because I'm fully convinced that you are all capable of theorizing creatively, actively. But you need to be encouraged, you need to be told that you are capable of doing so. And as I tried to point out in my talk, of course, the choice of theoretical tradition in which you want to engage is entirely yours. I have tried to make a plea that you pay some attention to the liberal international theory tradition, but I'm sufficiently agnostic to say, okay, whatever has your interest, go for it.
Okay, great. Well, Professor Jørgensen, it was such an honor to host you today. Thank you so much for your insights, your lecture, your opinions, your knowledge that you shared with all of us. We feel very honored. I would like to thank all attendees, the scholars, the students, the friends who are here with us today. I would also like to bring to your attention that our next distinguished virtual lecture will be on February 29 with Professor Stephen Rosso, a political theorist. He's also the president of the interdisciplinary section of the International Studies Association. So stay tuned for that. And with that, thank you so much. And we wish you to study and contemplate and write about IR theory more and create this network of mindful scholars who will come together and have these beautiful discussions and advance the field further. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jørgensen. It was a great honor to host you today. Professor Tsardanidis, I don't know if you would like to say a last word as the director of the Institute. If you have a good connection, I guess he cannot connect very well. So with that, I would like to thank you and wish you farewell and see you the next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Professor Jørgensen, very much. Bye to everybody. Thank you.